I've been reading tarot since around early 2000. I have over 130 tarot decks in my collection, and yet some of the most influential decks, what we would consider classic RWS inspired decks, have never made it to my table. Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I wanted to share with you some of the classic RWS inspired decks that I missed out on up until now. And so there were these decks, right? These sort of classic RWS decks that have been around, most of them since the 70s. And I just never managed to get a hold of one. Never actually brought one into my collection. And the funny thing is these are all decks that are still in publication today. They are all mass-produced decks, so they are relatively inexpensive. And yet, for some reason, I just never felt the call, I guess, to purchase them. Or maybe I just wasn't in a place in my tarot journey that I could really appreciate them. And so over the last few months, I've been sort of looking through some of those types of decks, those older, primarily anything pre-1990. That was kind of my cutoff point, mostly just because that's when I started getting into tarot, and so I really wasn't looking at anything that was really popular or new at that time. I really was looking at things that were pre-1990s. I may have one exception in here, I can't remember. But anyway, I was looking at those decks, and I, put some messages out on my Facebook group, asking what people considered a classic tarot deck, like those decks that are really foundational to, I think, the way that we look at tarot now, the way that the culture of tarot has really evolved. And there are some pretty influential ones in there, I think. And those were the ones that I was kind of drawn to. I did a bunch of research. I spent a lot of time looking at imagery. And what's really funny is most of these decks, like I said, they're mass market, they're readily available. So they're like $20 US or under. And yet I spent more time researching these decks than I do like some of my super pricey indie decks or my out of print decks. So I think that whole experience of really taking the time to look at decks that were created and published prior to the 1990s, looking at what they brought to the tarot community, what they brought to the culture of tarot, and how they've really helped expand upon what we now see as a tarot deck. Some of the decks that I've been looking at, I think, were a lot more influential than we really give them credit for, or that we really think about or talk about now. And so, especially with all the new decks coming out, we are just overwhelmed with new decks, right? They're coming out all the time. They're coming out mass market, they're coming out indie. And I think that's really great. And there's this huge variety of decks out and available now and coming soon. We have Kickstarter and all that. But I think sometimes it's kind of good to take a step back from all of that and really kind of touch base with the root of the practice, so to speak. And so that was kind of where I was at, and the research that I've actually been doing over the last few months. I really wasn't looking to buy every deck published prior to 1990s. I was just really looking for those ones that seemed to be really key. There were a couple of criteria that I was going by. One was they had to be published prior to that date. They had to be still in print, so still available. And they had to be decks that, for the most part, as far as I could tell, have never gone out of print. And so it was really interesting to take a look at what has really stood the test of time over the last, 50 or so years. And it was a really fun experience. And I do have to say that getting these decks in my hand after doing all the research on them and really exploring what they brought to the culture of tarot, it's been really an enlightening and a really fun exercise. I was surprised by several of the decks, because several of the decks I was just I'm never going to get that deck. That's just not for me. And then when I finally got it and I did the research on it and I spent some time with it, there were a few in there, and I really only have 4 to share with you today, 4 that are new to me. And when I got them in my hands, I was like, I was kind of surprised, to be perfectly honest. I was pleasantly surprised. I really, really like these decks. I'm really excited to really start working with them and dive deeper with them. I've spent a lot of time researching them and getting to know them on that level. So now I'm really looking forward to getting to know them on a more hands-on basis, to actually shuffle them, do readings with them. I've been looking through them a lot. I've been holding them, handling them, touching them, but as of this moment, I haven't done readings with any of them because I really wanted to get this video done first. I wanted this to really be sort of my overall first impression of these decks that have been around for 50 years or so. So I'm really excited to share with you these 4 decks that I've just now discovered, that I've always known have existed. I've always seen them. They've always been around in the tarot community. And I'm really excited to finally be able to experience them for myself. It's like I kind of get what all the fuss was about now. So I'm going to go ahead and flip the camera around and we're going to take a look at these decks. The Aquarian Tarot is an Art Deco inspired deck by David Palladini that states it brought tarot symbolism into the modern age. It was originally published in US Games in 1970 and has been in print ever since. While the Aquarian Tarot does not seem to attract much attention these days, its 50-year run speaks to the timelessness of these cards. Although the booklet describes it as an authentic interpretation of the medieval tarot, it is clear that the structure follows the Waite-Smith system. But what is perhaps so powerful and enduring about this deck is that connection. The images are familiar, but the color palette is muted, giving the deck an almost moonlit, melancholy feel. It's the artwork itself and the symbolism embodied within it that speaks to the heart as well as the mind. So the Aquarian Tarot was one that I honestly kind of steered clear of, mostly because of the complete lack of color in any of these faces. They're not so much white as just devoid of color, and there's a lot of white in the background that feels almost like a void as well. And I know that's really, this whole art style is really indicative of the Art Deco, which was really popular during the, 60s and early 70s. And that is definitely reflected in this deck, which is the time period that it was created in. And I really like the orange colors that we see in a lot of the cards, but that sort of white space kind of throws me sometimes when I see it. However, I do love all this sort of watercolory background that we get in a lot of the cards. I think it's just really pretty, that contrast of the sort of watery skyline that we see in the background with these brighter colors, those pops of orange and yellow and reds that we get throughout. It's a really interesting color palette. It's bold and pastel at the same time, which is quite interesting. There is this kind of energy that radiates from these cards. There's like a history here. And I think that's really more than anything what I'm picking up on now is that sense of history that is in these cards. This is, one of the earliest, as far as I could tell in my research, one of the earliest Rider-Waite-Smith clones, so to speak, or Rider-Waite-Smith inspired decks. It was definitely one of the most popular ones, I think, in terms of its sales. It's definitely still a popular one. It is still around. It's still readily available. I quite enjoy the artwork. I quite enjoy the colors. I find that it's the figures, I just don't pay any attention to the faces, and that's really where I found the key is for this. I also think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on when we have all this white space in the backgrounds, because some of the cards have them and some of them don't. So I think that would be a really interesting thing to explore. And then in comparison, you have these gorgeous full color images that I just really love. They have this really pleasing palette to them that's just really lovely. And so it's really interesting when you get, cards that are like pink pastel, and then we have cards that are like really quite bright and, reds and oranges, and oh, here's an even better one, like the sun card. And then you have like cards like this where we have like all the scene is like set over the top of the white space and there's no sky. It's really interesting that there's almost 3 different art styles in this deck. I know they're all Art Deco, but there's 3 different variations within each of these cards. We have these ones that are like full color. They have an almost watery and color pencil-y feel to them. And then we have these bright, bold cards with the, you know, the reds and the oranges and the yellows that really pop out at us. And then we have these interesting cards where the scene's like overlaid over just like a white background and there's no detail in the background whatsoever. So I just thought that was really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to kind of exploring maybe why that is, or, you know, how that might play into a reading. If you've got some experience with this deck and can kind of shine some light on that for me, I would really appreciate it, because I would love to know if there was a reason why there's this almost shift in style between some of the cards in the deck. So again, here, really interesting, we have the High Priestess, who has this really beautiful landscape painted background behind her, and then the Empress has no background really. I mean, she has this rock structure behind her, but she really has, there's no skyline, there's nothing there. It's like void. And I think that's really interesting. And I'm trying to figure out, like, is there some reason for that? Is there some correlation? And what might that mean when it comes up in a reading? This deck on first glance kind of feels like, I don't want to say cold, because it doesn't necessarily feel cold, but it feels like it doesn't have a ton of emotion in it until we get to a card like this. And then I feel like there's a lot of emotion in that card, actually. Not so much in the figure, but in the sky and the landscape itself and the swords themselves, which I think is really interesting. So this is a deck that's kind of like, it's kind of got me puzzled. So I do have to say the backs are not my favorite. Like, I kind of wish, I know they're like super iconic, but I kind of wish they were like red or orange or something that matched the deck better. I just feel like the blue feels out of place with this deck. I do quite like this card stock. I'm gonna knock my box over, my empty box. Whoops, they're a little slippery, as you can see, but I think they shuffle beautifully. I really think, I put my box back, keeps blowing away because it's empty. I really think this is going to be a beautiful deck to work with. I'm really excited to dive into the images. The little white book reminds us that new meaning can be found in old symbols, and holding a deck like the Aquarian Tarot in your hand certainly gives you that sense of ageless wisdom. There's a sense of history here, an almost energetic tie, as if the deck has absorbed all the collective wisdom over the decades. It's as if these brand new cards radiate with the energy of its ancestors. Originally published in 1979 by U.S. Games, the Morgan-Greer, illustrated by Bill Greer under the direction of Lloyd Morgan, was considered to be a quite modern deck in its day. In fact, the introduction in the Little White Book states that the Morgan-Greer Tarot is the first modern deck based upon the combined research of Arthur Edward Waite and Paul Foster Case. 40 years later, the imagery can still be considered modern when we compare it to that of the original RWS or Marseille, but it now has a bit of a retro vibe. The lush imagery, bold colors, closer perspective, and borderless design give the classic RWS structure an intimate feel. The only way I can describe it is to say it's like an old friend, as if you could develop a personal relationship with each of the figures on the 78 cards and know them on an intimate level. At the time of this deck's publication, that would have certainly been revolutionary and a modern depiction of the standard tarot. Of all these decks that I've brought into my collection over the last few months, I think the Morgan-Greer is really my favorite. I have kind of fallen in love with these bright, bold colors. I really love the imagery, porn stashes aside. And I feel that this really does have this sort of kind of retro, but also still modern and relevant imagery. I've been really excited to work with this one. I really wanted to get my hands on it. This is the one that I personally have been feeling the strongest pull towards. There is just something about this imagery. There's something about this artwork that really does speak to me on a really interesting level. You know, I have a lot of decks with bright, bold artwork in my collection. I have a lot of decks that have a similar style artwork, but there's just something about this deck that really just kind of calls to me. I don't even know how to really explain it, because it's really just an up close and intimate look at the Rider-Waite-Smith. But these characters feel super approachable. And like I said, they feel like old friends, like you could get to know each and every one of them. And I think the artwork is really beautiful, but it might be the really dark, bold lines with the really bright, bold colors that calls to me. And I do quite like having this deck in my hands. I have not done any readings with it yet, so that's next on my list because I'm really looking forward to doing that. But this imagery just really does speak to me. I mean, even this Three of Swords that is so classically Pixies art, I just really do like it. I also like that sometimes like all the figures are like a solid color, which I think is really interesting. It makes them look like a little bit shadowy, which I think will be really interesting to maybe tie into the readings. But there really is just something about this artwork that just, I don't know if it's because it takes me back to my childhood. You know, I was born in the late 70s, and so this type of style, this type of aesthetic was still, you know, around when I was a young child. And it really does just, I don't know, kind of just speaks to me. This is the one that I've been like most excited to actually start doing readings with. I've been trying to wait to not actually dive into readings with any of these decks so that I could do these little walkthroughs first. And I know I didn't do a full flip through of the Aquarian, but I'll try to do them up the rest of them. But this is the deck that I've been like, can't wait to do readings with this one. I do not know what it is about this imagery. I do not know what it is about this deck. I even love these backs. Like, they're super iconic now, right? But I just think they're so cool. I do have to say that the cardstock isn't, it's nice, and I do like it, and it's a little stiff. But maybe that will kind of break in after a while. I don't think it's quite as nice as the cardstock on the Aquarian. I kind of like that better. But I think this really is lovely cardstock. I do like that it's totally borderless too. That's really cool. Look how cool these cards are laid out together. I'm super excited to work with this one. But there's definitely something, you know, very iconic, nostalgic, but also timeless in these cards. I love this Nine of Swords. I've seen that image like a million times, right? I've seen it online. I've seen it in other videos. Seeing it in person, totally different experience. But as I was saying about the cardstock, this cardstock is a little less flexible than, say, the Aquarian. And I have heard other people mention that the Italian version of this deck has different cardstock. So I am considering getting that just so that I can, you know, maybe see what the differences are. If nothing else comes out of exploring these sort of classic RWS decks that I missed out on, then me just being able to connect with the Morgan-Greer, that I think that's wonderful. Even just to be able to make a connection with just one of these decks is fantastic. I do have to say that I'm kind of like, I don't know, I'm kind of crushing on a couple of them a little bit. Like the Morgan-Greer is definitely, I think, the one that I'm like, oh, we need to get to know each other. Today, the Morgan-Greer is still considered a best-selling deck. The back design is iconic, the imagery is retro, and holding this deck in my hands brings me back to my childhood. Yet there is a timelessness to them. 4 decades later, and this classic deck still feels very modern and relevant. Published in 1985 by US Games, the Hanson-Roberts Tarot is a reimagining of Pamela Coleman Smith's artwork through the artistic genius of illustrator Mary Hansen-Roberts. She devoted around 8 months to the creation of these fairy tale images, beautifully rendered in color pencil. Smaller than a traditional tarot deck, the Hansen-Roberts holds an almost childlike quality in both size and aesthetic. It is perhaps its smaller size, combined with the approachable imagery, that makes this deck a still popular favorite among new readers. So one of the things that kind of surprised me about the Hansen-Roberts Tarot is its actual size. I mean, you can see it's quite a little deck. A little bit closer to maybe playing card size. Here it is next to the Morgan-Greer. So it's kind of like maybe like those first generation mini decks. It's not quite as small as the new tin decks, but it is definitely smaller than a regular sized tarot. This deck is quite cute, but there is a depth and a humanity to this deck that I do really appreciate. The one complaint that I really have about this deck, besides the standard US Games copyright, is these titles. If they feel a little bit gratuitous, and I think, you know, it might have been a little bit better had they not tried to cram 4 languages on there. But it does cover the artwork in some cases, and I just feel like some simpler titles could have been a little bit better on this deck. But this deck is absolutely gorgeous. It's like soft and really human. The faces and the expressions are really wonderful in this deck. Sometimes the perspective is off a little bit, but I think that just really kind of adds to its charm and its appeal. It has a wonderful sort of fairy tale-like quality to it that I really quite enjoy. I do believe in the guidebook they had mentioned that it was done at like twice its original size, so I'm guessing these weren't super large pieces of art to begin with, but they are wonderfully detailed, even despite the fact that they're not really huge. And I do really like the soft palette, the color pencil look that gives a lot of texture and movement to the cards, which I think is really interesting. And I think that there's a lot of detail that you can dive into in these scenes, even though these are little cards. The imagery is, of course, very Rider-Waite-Smith. It's definitely, you know, in the guidebook they talk about it being inspired by Pixie's art. And we definitely get that sense from this deck, but it does kind of do its own thing as well. It definitely has a sort of fairy tale-like quality to it that I think is really lovely. And again, it's kind of a small, like kind of cute deck. I'm really looking forward to working with it. The size is going to be interesting because I think that because it is a little bit smaller, you might be able to do a little bit larger readings than maybe you normally would with, say, a standard size tarot. And I think that that could be really interesting because we might be able to gain these really interesting messages. It totally looks like Merlin to me. This looks like Hansel and Gretel. I mean, you can see like every time I pull one of these cards or I look through this deck, like I kind of get pulled back into like childhood fairy tales, which is one of the reasons why I think I really like it. It kind of speaks to that storybook energy that I definitely like, and I do have a lot of decks that kind of feature that kind of energy, and so I think that's one of the reasons why I really do quite like this. But I'll be interested to actually, you know, do some readings with it, to do some larger readings with it. I mean, look at him. He's kind of super misery, but, you know, he also, maybe he's just content with what he has. Maybe he's not hoarding it. Maybe he's just content. That could be a really good Four of Pentacles message, content with what he has. Anyway, I really like this little deck. It's so cute. The images are really wonderful. I think to say that it's cute is maybe a little bit misleading because I feel like there is a depth to this deck as well that we don't necessarily always contribute or attribute to a cute deck. Like a deck can be cute and deep. It's a really wonderful shuffler. Like it shuffles beautifully. I'm sure partly because it's small, so it fits in my hands really well. But also it's got that US Games cardstock that I do actually like. It's got a nice weight, nice texture. The backs are really pretty. I do really like the backs. I have considered, like, you know, I could trim it. It would be really pretty without its borders. And I might, but then that's going to be a really, really small deck. So we shall see. Let's lay out a few cards. Oh, it did have a couple of title cards with it. So, or an actual title card and an art card. And I just thought those were so pretty. I'm going to hold those out and like put those in a journal or something because I just thought they were really pretty and I really liked them. So let's just pull out a few cards here so we can see how they look laying on the table together. I mean, how beautiful. It does give me the feeling of like stepping into a storybook. I think that's really wonderful. I'm definitely looking forward to doing some readings with this deck. I think it's going to be really interesting. I love decks that transport me to like another world, like a little fairy tale. I think there's so much that you can dive into in that, pulling in those kind of fairy tale-esque stories, myths, and lessons, because really fairy tales, you know, they teach us lessons. So yeah, another gorgeous little tarot that I have missed out on for many years. I think mostly with this one, like I just looked at it and I thought, oh, it's just, you know, it's a sweet tarot deck. It's a sweet little fairy tale type tarot deck. And I have so many of those, which I do. But I think this one definitely has a depth and a humanity to it that is probably very underrated. I don't know that I often hear people say that about it, but I think it's definitely there. And I'm looking forward to exploring that a lot more. The images have a storybook feel, but there is a depth and humanity to each of the characters and scenes. It's easy to see why this deck is still listed among the top recommendations for new readers. It's approachable and friendly with a soft fairy tale energy that magically manages to retain the fire of the human spirit. Although not published until 1991 by Llewellyn, the self-titled Robin Wood Tarot took nearly a decade to design. It would be easy to dismiss this deck as just another Rider-Waite clone, but there's something unique about the play of symbolism and imagery in this deck. Rich in pagan influences, artist Robin Wood combined the traditional RWS structure with contemporary symbolism and pastoral scenes to create a unique deck that is both classic and modern. So the Robin Wood Tarot is another deck that I think I just dismissed because it was another Rider-Waite-Smith clone, or so I thought. It definitely is. It definitely adheres to the Waite-Smith system, but it does kind of do its own thing, which is really interesting, and I don't think I would have really noticed or perhaps appreciated until I had it in my hands and really started looking at these cards in detail. I mean, look at this devil. This is a departure from Pixie's artwork, and it's very powerful, it's very memorable and iconic, and it definitely goes its own way. And there are a lot of cards in this deck that actually do that, even though it still adheres pretty closely to the Rider-Waite-Smith system. So I really do enjoy this artwork. I think it has a lot of texture, a lot of detail, a lot of humanity to it, which I do really appreciate. The Pentacles is my favorite suit in this deck for sure. And I do like that the Kings and Queens are depicted a bit older. That is definitely a pet peeve of mine. So I really enjoy how the courts are depicted in this particular deck and the age of ranges that we see within this deck itself. I mean, generally we see like an older figure in the Eight of Pentacles, but here we have a child. And I think that really does create a different context in terms of the card and its reading. This guy to me looks like Indiana Jones, which again, kind of funny, just pulling in those sort of more modern, well, not really modern anymore, but modern-ish imagery into the kind of also medieval imagery that we see, or the pagan vibe. So we have a really big variety of styles here. This Four of Pentacles cracks me up. The look on this guy's face is just kind of priceless. That one just kind of cracks me up. But I really like the colors. I love the, like I said, I love the Pentacle suit. And I do quite like that the quartz are depicted more along the lines of how I see the maturity level, so to speak, of them. But again, you can see here very much in line with Pixie's art. We have the figure in, you know, that with the 10 swords in the back. But I really do quite like it. There are a couple of cards in here that I think really lock into an interpretation, like the thiefy energy with the 7 of Swords, but I still think it's wonderful. The faces are also very expressive in this deck, which I really do like. And the colors are really rich. And to get that using colored pencil is pretty cool. I do also like the color coding that we get to the quartz in each of the suits, which I think is really cool. Look at this 8. I mean, this is a very modern looking 8. These look like rockets, but we tie that to here we have the 7 of Wands. We have this, you know, a little bit more historic looking figure here. And then we go like, here's a knight on a horse. And so I think it's a really interesting play of all of the different sort of eras. I feel like this deck kind of spans the eras of humanity a little bit, and I think that's really interesting how it does that. And I do quite like it. But again, like, look at these faces. They are so expressive. I'm really interested to kind of get to know each of these characters a little bit more. This Six of Cups for me, this is a very iconic Six of Cups. I feel like I've seen that one many, many times. Just gorgeous, gorgeous deck, gorgeous artwork. This is another one that I'm really looking forward to working with and getting to know on a deeper level, to doing some readings with. I think it has a really unique energy to it, a really unique vibe that I'm looking forward to exploring more. Here's the backs, which have like an almost Celtic sort of feel to it with the knotwork. I do have to say that this cardstock is probably my least favorite of these four. It's a little bit more shiny, a little bit more slippery. Let's give it a shuffle and see how it shuffles. Oh, it shuffles really nicely though. I do like that. I love a deck that just shuffles really well. So beautiful. Let's just lay down a couple cards here. See how they look. And again, it's like I said, it's like transporting you to like this storybook world on the one hand, but it's a more mature version. It's like Grimm's fairy tales versus Disney fairy tales. Like, I mean, this is not, Grimm's fairy tales are actually, you know, quite disturbing in a lot of ways. And these are not disturbing in that sense. I just mean that Grimm's fairy tales are not meant for children. They're meant for grown-ups. And I feel like the Robin Wood Tarot is like kind of along that lines of it's a grown-up deck. And although it has this kind of fairy tale vibe to it, it feels like grown-up fairy tales versus the really cute, sweet sort of Disney fairy tales, you know, or children's fairy tales that we tend to see these days. And I really think that it has a wonderful energy to it. I'm really looking forward to working with it. The Robin Wood Tarot has a maturity and ageless wisdom that radiates from these cards. The imagery is approachable in the sense that there's something very familiar within these cards, but there is a depth and an inherent power within these scenes that elevates it to another level. The pagan influences woven throughout the modern symbolism are intelligently designed, and one can see how this deck remains a popular choice among novice and seasoned readers alike. So today we looked at the Aquarian Tarot, the morgan-greer Tarot, the Hansen-Roberts Tarot, and the Robin Wood Tarot. And these are all still readily available from their publishers. These three decks are all available from US Games, and the Robin Wood is available from Llewellyn. So I hope you enjoyed this look at some of the classic RWS inspired decks that I missed out on previously, decks that have been around forever, that have stood the test of time, and yet somehow I never managed to pull into my collection until now. I would love to know what your experiences are. If you have these decks, do you still work with them? Have you had them a long time? So please feel free to share in the comments below. Thank you for joining me today. You will find links for the decks featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.